Everyone, welcome back to the class. This is going to be our first regular lecture of the semester. So the first one before this was just reviewing the syllabus and everything about the class. But now this one is going to be a lecture on identity, social construction, and intersectionality. Those are going to be some of the main concepts in this lecture. And there's going to be some other ones as well. So a couple things as you're going along. First off, make sure you're kind of highlighting key terms in your own additional notes or as you look through the slideshows while watching the lectures, and I'll be highlighting those as I go. And also, I'm going to be doing this at a relatively quick pace because you can watch it at home. So I recommend that if you miss something, just pause, go back, watch it again, and that way you can follow along completely throughout. So right now you should open up your PowerPoint presentation for the lecture entitled Identity, Social Construction, and Intersectionality. So we're on now the first slide, so not the title slide, but the first slide that says Introduction at the top. So sometimes I'm going to be reading off of what's on the PowerPoint. Sometimes I'm just going to be, lecturing from additional notes that I have. So, all right. Many people would describe identity, one of our key terms, as the way they see themselves and the way they're seen by others. So such a description captures the importance of identity to the relationships between people, or another important term we use in this class all the time is the importance then to social relations, right? So we're going to be talking about how identity is something that's really intersubjective, that emerges in the relationships between people and is more than just an internally held view of oneself. And also in this course, identity will be an important lens that we use to examine how power operates in various political, economic, and of course, especially given the title of the class, cultural contexts. So moving to the next slide. As we look forward towards this semester, you're going to learn about why identity is an important concept for a range of different reasons when we're thinking about women's issues, when we're thinking about issues of race, of class, of sexuality, of sex, of age, of ability, of religion, of nationality, of ethnicity. We're going to be talking about how identity is important in all those various categories, but in particular, we're going to be looking first at how identity structures how we see ourselves and how we act in the world, which we're going to be talking about in this lecture. It also is a way through which people view others, right? Through the perceived or known identities that we have about somebody else. So people tend to act towards people based off of their perception of those people's identities. Also, identities emerge in and structure relations between people. And as this lecture is going to point out, the very ways in which we interact with people on a fundamental level are structured by our ideas about identity and what it means and how we're supposed to be representing it. Also important to this class is that identities are reflected in and also learned through culture. So culture is a very important aspect of identity, and as we'll point out, various identity categories range and differ based off of different cultural contexts. Also, identities are a central part of modern day politics, and they also appear in the economic sphere through various forms of inequality. And finally, identities circulate transnationally through globalization and cultural imperialism, things that we'll be talking about later in this course when we get to our third unit. So, to the next slide now. We're going to have this lecture in two different sections. So our first major section is on constructing identity categories. And our key terms or concepts for this are identity, subjectivity, social construction, intersubjective, and identity as performance or doing identity. So, before we go ahead, just on your own, take a moment and brainstorm the major identity categories, okay, that you are familiar with. You might want to think about what you see on the census, on government documents, school forms, or even in the media. So to get you started, here are two important ones that we'll use in this course a lot, sex and gender. So take a moment, pause this video, and see how many you can write down. Alrighty, so I'm going to move ahead now to the next slide. For this course, we're going to be considering a number of different identity categories, such as sex, gender, religion, race, ethnicity, nationality, age, and ability. So hopefully a lot of you got most of those, and I would imagine between the entire class, we probably definitely got every single one of those. So, to the next slide, identities as social constructions. So, every identity that you could possibly think of typically carries with it a number of descriptors that are associated with it. Sometimes those might be physical descriptors that have, for example, with race to do with skin tone. Or they might oftentimes be kind of behavioral things about behaviors, maybe even attitudes and beliefs of particular groups of people based off of identity. So, as a result of those sorts of associations, identities carry with them a number of expectations regarding how people are supposed to act, appear, behave, etc. So, this is why you hear terms like ladylike contrasted with other terms like bitch, right? These indicate what is considered to be proper behavior for someone who identifies as or is identified as a woman within, Western society, for example, right? So this doesn't necessarily mean that our identities require us to act a certain way, not at all, right? But what it does mean is that when you have a certain identity within any social context, you're set up with what we call a path of least resistance. In other words, there's a certain set of behaviors that you're expected to uphold. And if you do, then you tend to get less resistance, right? Less experiences of discrimination, oppression, marginalization. But if you go outside of that path of least resistance, right? That's the title, Path of Least Resistance, then you're met with a lot of social resistance, right? So our identities don't require us to act in a certain way, but because they're so imbricated within society, we find ourselves facing these sorts of paths of least resistance, right? In other words, these things kind of become normalized within our society. Therefore, rather than seeing identities as necessarily biological, right? Because this is kind of an now outmoded way of thinking about identity. For example, thinking about race is just about skin tone and not about social, political, and cultural practices that form and reform the category, let's say, black. But that actually we're also looking at identities as something that are very social, right? That are constructed within social relations, that are subject to change, right? And so that the ways in which, for example, certain notions about what skin tone means, right? Certain ideas about who people are attached to the body through certain biological reference points like skin tone or hair type or perceived sexual organs. That the ways in which those meanings are attached to those bodies is through social relations, right? Those meanings aren't carried just naturally by those bodies. Another way we can think about this, and we'll talk about this more, I think, during this lecture, is that you can always think of it like this. Like, if somebody lived by themselves in a world with no people whatsoever, would they identify in the way that they do, right, in a world with other people? Would they hold those same sorts of identity categories, those ideas of themselves through identity, if they lived in a world with no other people? So, to the next slide. So, as I kind of mentioned, these meanings change over time significantly. So, what was deemed ladylike in the 1800s might, and definitely actually is not the same as is today. They also vary by location. So, we might say what's deemed ladylike, right, in the United States is very different than what might be deemed ladylike in the other countries. And I'm kind of exaggerating my voice because, of course, the term ladylike I find to be a bit silly and outmoded, and a term that we'll definitely be criticizing along with many others during this course. So, in conclusion, central to this course is the notion that identities are socially constructed, that they emerge and are maintained and also change through social relations as different meanings are strung together and attached to particular bodies, and again, vary over time and location, and are subject to forms of change that we might call reconstruction, right? So, as we'll learn in this course, that doesn't mean that identities are unimportant, right? Or that if we just stop talking about them and stop thinking about them, that experiences of marginalization, the sorts of statistical inequalities that we see distributed between different identitarian groups, it doesn't mean those would go away, right? You see a lot of people in the media that will say something like, oh, racism only exists because people keep on talking about it, right? And this isn't the case at all, because these sorts of identities and the sorts of systems that continue to create them are very imbricated within social, political, and economic relations, practices, and even like tacit subconscious beliefs about how the world should be and how people should act within it. So that simply not talking about race or simply not talking about gender doesn't get rid of sexism at all, because those things, those forms of systemic oppression are built into our social fabric, our political and economic institutions, and even, as we'll talk about, of course, our cultural practices. So now on to the ninth slide, section C, identities as intersubjective. So one term that I always really loved learning about because I always thought it's so kind of speaks to your day-to-day experiences is the term subjectivity. So subjectivity for this course, and you see different definitions of it, but for this course, try and think of subjectivity as referring to how we see and understand ourselves and our actions in the social world in relationship to others, right? In essence, subjectivity structures what we do. Um, and so the way I kind of like to, I mean, there's a whole bunch of different examples you could use to describe this, um, but uh, but to put it simply, I'm Alex, right? And every time I do any sort of action, anytime I decide to do something, I'm doing that thing as Alex, right? So somebody who was a different person than me, had a different subjectivity, would make different decisions in situations like that, right? So and that doesn't just mean that these decisions are just like knee jerk reactions that are learned by different people. I'm also talking about thought out decisions about how to act in the social world, right? And subjectivity is really important to thinking about a course like this because our identity is very connected with our subjectivity. So, how I see myself acting in the world as Alex is very built into my ideas of myself as male, my ideas around my national. Citizenship and privilege that comes from that, my ideas about my sexuality, my ideas about my ethnicity, and all these sorts of things all play into how I do Alex, right? Every single day, every time I make a decision to do something. Another kind of funny, weird example that I always like to use is that there's been a lot of psychological studies that on psychedelic and psychotropic drugs that have pointed out that when you hear a lot of times people talk about what they'll call like a bad trip, what they're talking about is actually being, I don't know, to say so far gone on their trips that they forget who they are, right? So they no longer know themselves as, let's say Alex or James or Stephanie. They just forget who they are. And because of that, they don't know how to really act in the world, right? Because that sort of undergirding structure of their subjectivity is no longer there to help them kind of, help them along with knowing, okay, this is what I'm going to do. Um, so, um, because our subjectivity is structured by our identity, but because we carry multiple identities, we might also say that we can kind of have multiple subjectivities, sometimes experienced in overlap, many of which might be oriented around our various identities. So, because of the fact that we face different systems of oppression based off of the identities that we have, if you're a person of color, racism, if you're a woman, sexism, if you are transphobia, if you are not heterosexual, forms of homophobia, or other forms of sexual marginalization. So, because of that, we're constantly navigating the world in ways that respond to those experiences, right? Again, our subjectivity at work here. And because of that, we sometimes have to make decisions that might, in some sort of way, tactically privilege one of those identities. So, for example, we could think about this in terms of passing. Um, so, passing refers to various ways in which people who might be trans or who might be gay or lesbian or have other forms of marginalized identity. Even this term dates back to being able to pass as white when you came from a background of color. These refer to ways of kind of being able to tactically engage one of your identities in order to navigate society, right? So, and there examples abound. So there's this form of feminism that we'll talk about way later in the semester called differential feminism, which kind of is built from the viewpoints of people who live lives in multiple systems of oppression and therefore have developed ways of navigating the world that sometimes switches between different subjectivities based off of your experiences of those different systems, right? Um, Now, another thing that we could say about our identity is that it is intersubjective. And when I say intersubjective, I mean that these identities emerge in and are maintained by relations between people in which subjectivities come into contact, right? So when we interact with other people, their subjectivities and our subjectivities are interacting with one another in ways that are constantly reinforming and reshaping those various subjectivities. There's different ideas about ourselves and how we're supposed to act in the social world, ideas that are very built in with the notions of identity, right? So uh when we say, love, for example, as it says on the slideshow here, is intersubjective, right? Love is something that is intersubjective. It's based off of the relations between two or more people and includes assumptions about other people in the sort of formation of that concept, right? As well as ideas about the self, right? So we're talking about intersubjective things, right? And identities, of course, are similarly intersubjective. To move back to that idea of, social construction and the example of growing up in a world with no other people, like, would this thing exist, right? When we think about identities, and intersubjective is being something that kind of exists, or that social construction is something that requires intersubjective kind of interfacing between people, um, then it's hard to imagine somebody living in a world and, for example, having a conceptualize the notion of themselves as female or male specifically, or gay or lesbian specifically, without there being other people in the world through which they can kind of understand and actualize those identities. So, moving on to the next slide. This is slide 10 now. To continue to talk kind of about identities as intersubjective, we can understand this in a different way by asking ourselves how we feel validated by others in our own identities, right? So you can take about a moment to to kind of think about this for yourself, and for everyone, the answer will be a bit different, right? But if you identify as, let's say, male, or if you identify as bisexual, or if you identify as any number of other sorts of identities, how do you feel validated when interacting with other people in your own notions of your identities, right? In your own notions of yourselves. So go ahead and take a moment to think about that, maybe even write stuff down about it. All right. So, when our identities are recognized and validated by others, it makes it more likely for us to maintain those behaviors. This kind of links back to this idea of the path of least resistance, right? And also to the idea of social construction, because these forms of validation typically reflect kind of socially agreed upon ways of behaving, right? And performing your various identities, right? Similarly, we are more likely to validate in others the things we value in ourselves. So, for example, to say this again, as young children, we learn this path of least resistance regarding how to behave without facing social ramifications, right? And we might think about the policing of gender expressions at a very young age through expressions like sissy or tomboy, right? That are used to kind of police people's behavior and are clear examples of the parameters of this path of least resistance. And this is this sort of system, right, where identities are constantly being policed by various people, right, in this sort of subjective way, is the thing that makes identities appear natural, right? So in our society, most people, let's say, that are women, might kind of have a very similar path of least resistance in terms of a various set of behaviors that are expected of them as women, right? And of course, this varies by race, by class, by age, by sexuality, but there is, let's say, this path of least resistance. And if everybody, if the majority of people find themselves compelled, right, as you would expect anybody to in a system that carries such harsh social ramifications for people who do not conform, right, they feel compelled to maintain those same sorts of behaviors and to police in others those behaviors, right? And they do so much that there's almost no moment before these systems, right? So young children are brought into these systems from a very young age. So these systems almost appear natural, right? Because it's kind of hard to imagine a world without them, right? However, those systems, right, and those identities are constantly being reproduced, reconstructed, right, and maintained because of social, relations, because of political and economic systems and different cultural practices, right? So even though these various behaviors that are associated with, let's say, femininity or masculinity appear to be typical, the reality is that appearance requires constant maintenance. So, moving on to section D, identities as performances or doing identity. Um, So typically when we think of performance, we might describe it as doing something other than being our natural self, right? We have this idea that we have this sort of natural selves that are unquestioned, authentic, stable, and even with certain identities, right, rooted in our biology. As a lot of people would argue that sex and gender and sexuality and race are all strictly biological, but in this field, of course, and in this class we're questioning that notion. But when we think of performance, we think of it as doing something unnatural, right? But if we think of identities as not rooted in biology, but rooted in social relations, right? And that these identities are constantly being maintained and reconstructed, and at the same time, even contested, then it's not that crazy to think about identities as performances, right? However, they are performances that are repeated regularly on a day to day basis to the degree that, again, they appear natural or typical. So, for example, many people believe that women behave a certain way as a group in the ideal feminine way, kind of mentioned before. Um, and as also mentioned earlier, right, these ideas about femininity have been constructed and changed over time, right? Now, if women's biology hasn't fundamentally changed, even though we're going to question this idea of like a consistent, stable notion of female biology, but if certain biological things about human bodies haven't changed in 200 years, but notions of what is considered proper ladylike behavior have changed, then that indicates, obviously, that these very identities are constantly performed. Because if they don't emerge naturally out of our biology, then that means we're kind of in a both conscious and subconscious way continuing to do those identities every day by choice and not because we're compelled to through some sort of like biological thing, right? So therefore we can think of these identities as performances since they're not simply a matter of our nature, right? And much like a good performance, you can't tell the difference between what is in front of you and some notion of natural reality, right? Because maybe that natural reality doesn't even exist because we're looking at social relations that involve these sorts of performances, right? Much as with acting, that performance can also change quickly. So we tend to perform in ways that repeat themselves, developing a character, so to speak, right, that appears consistent to everybody who's perceiving us. Now, when we don't repeat that performance, right, when we do something different, we might face ridicule or we might be seen in a different way. That sort of intersubjective experience might kind of go in a different way, right? So, for example, I perform my masculinity on a day to day basis through the way I cultivate my appearance, my beard, my voice, my comportment, how I walk, right? The various activities that I partake in. But if I were to change even something as simple as, let's say, my dress, and switch to wearing clothes, that were in our society deemed to be female clothing, right? Then I would immediately be perceived differently by people everywhere I go, at the university, out in public, etc., right? So the need to repeat that performance, right, is very connected to this path of least resistance because this path of least resistance, right, always has various challenges on it. So you need to keep on repeating and doing the same thing, right, to create that illusion of consistency, that illusion of naturalness, right? And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about people performing their identities, right? So as mentioned earlier, right, a term like tomboy is used to describe and ridicule young girls who do not perform their gender to society standards, right? Now, over the course of their lifetime, the vast majority, studies have shown, of girls who identified as tomboys when they were young grow up to still perform various traditional forms of femininity, right? And this is one place where we might speculate that the path of least resistance has played, somewhat of a role. So, all right, moving to the next slide now. This is slide 12. So thinking about identities as performances, right? Or what we might say doing identity, okay, because you're kind of doing your identity every day. It emerges in social relations in these intersubjective ways, and we can think of that more specifically here. So we're actively looking to see how others perform their identities, both to understand whom we assume them to be based on their identities and to validate our own understandings of what those identities mean, right? I'm always looking at other guys and thinking about, like, okay, how are they doing their masculinity, right? And learning about my own masculinity through that in ways that might validate it or challenge it. But can definitely affect change in it. So, for this course, we'll be using the term performance along the term doing identity, right, to refer to displaying, reading, and interpreting signs of identity. So we display our identities through how we present ourselves, get dressed, how we act, behave, our attitudes, etc. We read other people's identities by looking for cues in their appearance and their behaviors to tell us, either who they are, or if we already know who they are, how they're performing that particular identity. And then we also interpret those cues by assigning meaning to them, right? Associating them with the identity we perceive that person to have. So you can take a moment if you want right now to think about or write down at least one example of how you yourself display, read, and interpret a particular identity category like your gender or your race in yourself and also in others when it comes to reading and interpreting. So you can pause the video for a moment while you do that, and we'll come back in a second. Okay, so now we're on to section 2, identity categories and intersectionality. Our key terms for this section are sex, gender, sexuality or sexual identity, race, class, and intersectionality. So if you'll turn the slide, we're now on slide 14. So we're going to talk a bit about sex and gender here. People oftentimes discuss sex and gender as though they're the same thing. This happens all the time. People use these terms interchangeably, right? While there are definitely strong connections between the two terms, and ideas about the both terms have kind of been built together through this various history. They have very different definitions that will be important to this course and are important to our field. So sex refers to various biological characteristics attributed to individuals, often at birth, and typically designating them into either male or female sex categories, right? Now, this has long been the definition of sex, seen in strictly biological terms. But this course will really challenge this definition of sex as strictly biological, male and female, in two ways. So first off, across the globe today and throughout history, we do not see a strict male-female notion of sexual difference, with many societies adopting more than two sexes. And second, even in the West specifically, the biological formulation for sex has been challenged in many fields of study. As mentioned earlier, this is not to say that sex has nothing to do with biology, or that identities in general have nothing to do with biology, but that the meanings assigned to biological differences are socially determined, right? So individuals, for example, born intersex and those who identify as transgender, or transsexual highlight how the strict male-female sex dichotomy is neither scientifically nor socially accurate, right? And just about in every sort of scientific field, the biological determinants used to talk about gender, or sex rather, which might include chromosomes, might include hormones, and might include genitalia. There's massive variation in all of those three categories, in ways that make it, even on a biological level, totally not this sort of binary or dichotomy male-female sort of world that people often insist on through their approach to sex, right? So, moving to the next slide, gender refers to the traits, behaviors, appearance, presentation, or as mentioned above, the performance of one's self relative to social understandings of gender. Now, this definition, I understand, sounds very circular, right? Gender is what people call gender. But since gender is socially constructed rather than natural or biological, this definition kind of captures the instability of our gender, right? So if we do not repeat or do our gender in consistent ways, then the meanings others assigned to us will change. Also, if the systems, right, that normalize certain behaviors for certain perceived gender categories, as those systems shift, but we don't shift our behavior accordingly, then similarly the meanings attached to our gender can kind of change. So gender is typically seen as being masculine or feminine in the West. However, exactly as mentioned above regarding sex, the male-female dichotomy does not exist in every part of the globe, nor does it include everyone in the West. Identity categories like transgender, genderqueer, and gender nonconforming are just some of the many that challenge the male-female dichotomy, things that we'll be talking about a lot over the course of this class. So moving on to letter B, sexuality and sexual identity. So this is another one where we're trying to kind of get these two terms separate from one another so people can think about their relationship but understand that they have very important differences, right? So much as with sex and gender, these terms are often thought of together and used interchangeably. But sexuality refers to the broad range of interests, pleasures, traits, behaviors, preferences, and dislikes that comprise our sexual lives. It could include whether we prefer the lights on or the lights off, or whether we like to cuddle, whether we like to talk during sex, or whether you like doing things with more than one person at a time. Now, sexual identity, on the other hand, typically refers to how you identify your sexuality to others, right? Here we're thinking about intersubjective, here we're thinking about social relations, right? And oftentimes, what we see in the West is that sexual identity typically refers to the gender of the people you do sexual things with. For example, two of the largest sexual identities in the West, straight and gay or lesbian, indicate solely what the gender of the person you are doing stuff with is, right? If you're a straight man, all we really know about you is that you like women. And if you're a gay man, all we really know about you is that you like men. And not only is this like a relatively narrow way of representing our very complex sexuality, but it's also very binary in its approach to thinking about gender and insisting on gender playing this key role, right, in sexuality that then results in this sort of binary approach to sexuality. You're either straight or you're gay, or you're bisexual, but bisexual still kind of maintains this sort of binary of there are men and there are women and there's no in between. There's just black and white, A and B. So, even the less frequently used terms like heterosexual and homosexual literally translate into different sex and same sex, referring to the sex of your partner. So, there's another way to understand socially constructed identity categories in terms of sexuality and sexual identity. So, our sexuality is vast, and rarely are there any two people that are exactly alike in their sexuality. But in the West, we allow sexual identity to limit aspects of this, our sexuality, into a single like dichotomy, right? Again, you're either male or female, and straight or gay. And so, this course is going to challenge this formulation in two important ways, right? Which you'll see kind of resonate through the same things around sex and around gender. So first off, that demonstrating that a heterosexual homosexual dichotomy does not translate to every context around the globe. And also by demonstrating how in the West people are actively challenging that same dichotomy with other forms of sexual identity not limited to bisexual, queer, asexual, and pansexual. So, another kind of interesting way to think about this difference between sexuality and sexual identity is to think about hetero and homosexuality in relationship to BDSM. So, if I were to ask you, for example, and just for reference, BDSM refers to bondage, domination, and sadomasochism. So, and if you can feel free to take a moment to pause this and look it up to learn a bit about it. But so to pose the question, right? If you had, for example, one straight couple and one straight couple who doesn't do BDSM and one straight couple who does do BDSM, right? You could argue that their sexual lives are pretty different, right? Their sexuality is very different, though their sexual identity might be the same in terms of social standards around labeling yourself as straight or gay, right? They're both straight couples. Now, if you had a third couple that was a gay couple who was into BDSM, right? You could make an argument that their sexuality involved more kind of similarities with the sexuality of the straight BDSM couple than the similarities between the two straight couples, right? So even though sexual identity forces us to think in this very narrow way about sexuality, the reality is the multitude and variety of sexual practices that exist out there and various proclivities and desires and preferences indicate that sexuality is something much bigger, right? So as a fun kind of exercise to think about this, I want you to take a moment to come up with a different system of sexual identity. So come up just like with something totally off the top of your head. I mean, my example was lights on and lights off. What if instead of straight and gay, we had lights on and lights off, right? So I want you to take a moment to think about your own system of sexual identification. Pause this video, write it down, and then come back. All right, so now after you're back, I want to ask just one question because I always find this to be interesting when I teach this in my classes. Did you end up creating a system of sexual identity that still had just two positions, like lights on and lights off? I most of the time when I'm teaching, I notice that the vast majority of students still create this sort of binary system, right? Which is really interesting because it indicates how, especially in the West, we tend to kind of privilege this sort of binary mode of thinking, right? Rather than having like a vast scale or other ways of thinking through identity categories. So, Moving to the next one, race. So, race is often understood as a group of people who share some set of physical characteristics and an assumed common origin. So, in this sense, race is seen as a very biological concept, right, that relates to ideas of having like a shared sexual and biological history. In fact, many people even believe that there's a gene for each racial group. It's amazing when you see surveys that ask people, like, is there a gene for being black? Is there a gene for being Asian, right? And so many people actually believe that there is. During slavery in the United States, race was seen as being in your blood, such that having one relative who was not white disqualified you from being white as well, with all the political protections that came from that, right? What was oftentimes called the one drop rule. Now, much as with sex, gender, and sexuality, racial categories are themselves socially constructed, even though they refer to biology in certain ways to justify the appearance of naturalness, right, of those very categories. So, as learned about with other identities, the meanings attached to those biological traits are socially determined and unstable and subject to change. So, I could one good example of this is this term racial construction, and this term was really developed by two political scientists called whose last names are Omi and Winant, and they use this term to refer to the processes by which racial categories are defined and made to appear natural. Now, they had this really interesting way of kind of questioning these categories by asking their students, what do you consider to be a black person? What makes a person a black person? And normally the first response that they would get is, well, skin tone. And they would easily say, well, if you think about it, there's people with darker skin tones than some black people who aren't perceived as black. So, for example, maybe people from the Philippines or from South America in the United States. And at the same time, there's people who are considered black with very light skin tones. And he would say, well, what else? And the students would continue to add on layers of this. They talk about things like facial structure or hair or all these various things. And these professors would constantly say, well, no, there's all this variation. There's all this variation, right? So how do we take a world where there is all of this variation and then create these categories that we call races and that we expect and kind of force in a way to appear natural? Well, you might say it's in much the same way that we do it with sexuality, right? We take this complex array of various traits, practices, attitudes, behaviors, and we kind of, cut out all the variation. We kind of try and ignore this huge overlap between these different categories, right? Like with the BDSM example, right? And we ignore this overlap and we say, okay, no, there's this category and there's this category and there's this category. And the borders between these categories are relatively clear, and that's just how it is, right? So this is racial construction at work. Now, and I need to stress this over and over again, as I said earlier in this lecture, just because these identity categories are socially constructed doesn't mean they're not important, right? Even though categories of race are socially constructed rather than strictly biologically determined, right, that doesn't mean that racism is simply something that we pretend or something that is performed, and that if we stop talking about or doing race, right, then all of a sudden racism would go away. So, um, yeah, that's a small aside, but to bring it back to the slide here, this class is going to kind of demonstrate that the meanings assigned to racial categories vary also by location, so that the racial organization of the U.S. is not the same as in other countries. However, in the last section of this course, we're going to look at the ways in which American racial categories and ideas about race are kind of exported to other parts of the world. So, the next slide, slide 20, is on class. So class refers to the hierarchy of positions determined by processes that distribute resources and social value disproportionately to a given population or populations. So class varies significantly from country to country, sometimes appearing as something like the caste system in India, or through terms like socioeconomic status, or even with terms like class or social class. Now, class often has to do with the distribution of wealth, as is largely the case in the United States. However, class also has to do with social prestige assigned to different groups, as seen, for example, with the caste system in India. Thus, you might hear somebody be described as classy or not classy, even though it might not refer to their actual monetary wealth, but to the expectations we have around how certain classes are supposed to be done or performed, as these are identity categories with social meanings, in addition to reference to various forms of wealth. So, class is something also that really importantly impacts other forms of social stratification, as women generally make less money than men, people of color generally make less money than whites, and able bodied people more money than people with disabilities. So, if you want to take a moment and ask yourself what class structure looks like in the United States. So, what are the classes we have in this country with which you're familiar? And who typically comprises those classes? What social prestige do those classes have? As you begin to answer these questions, what you might come to realize is that the category of class is filled based off of other systems of oppression, right? So, capitalism as an economic system that creates classes. It doesn't necessarily dictate, okay, well, people of color have to be in this class or women have to be in this class, right? It simply says these classes need to exist. But what determines who fills those classes is these other systems of racism and sexism, right, and ableism and homophobia that determine who gets paid what and for what sort of work. So, moving on to our next slide in our last section is around intersectionality, another really key important term for this course. So when we think about our identities on a government forum, they're oftentimes separated out, right? Ethnicity in one place, gender in another. But in our daily lives, our identities interact with one another such that the meaning of our gender, for example, is influenced by our race or our ethnicity, right? So how we perform our identities, how we perform our gender, for example, is also based off of ideas that are connected to our racial identity. And one term we use to capture that is intersectionality. So, intersectionality refers to the interconnected meanings and functions of our many identities. In fact, all of our identities interact. We never live as just one of them, but often and most times as all of them at once, right? So, I don't go out into the world ever as just a man who's doesn't have a racial identity, right? Every time I go out in the world, I go out in the world as a white man, right? And my experiences of the world go accordingly, right? So, as a concept, intersectionality is important for highlighting and understanding two important aspects of identity that are kind of been mentioned earlier. So, first off, identity structures how we see ourselves and how we act in the world, right? So, every time I'm making a decision about myself, about, remember, subjectivity, how is Alex going to do this thing at this time? All of those decisions are based off of my multiple interacting identities, right? And then, second to this, is identities are a central part of modern day politics. And therefore, when we think about how politics function, right, systems of racism and classism oftentimes work in coordination with one another. And when we think about how to battle those political systems, we need to think about how we can have kind of ways of resisting that consider multiple identity categories at once, right? So, to kind of go back and remember what we discussed earlier about subjectivity, right? Our identity is a major part of our subjectivity. And every time we make a decision about what we're going to do, we're kind of unconsciously asking ourselves and answering, how would I normally interact in this situation for me as Alex, as a white man, etc., etc. Since our identities are performed, you're also kind of asking yourself, how do I act in a way that verifies other people's identities of who I am? When you begin to ask yourself these questions unconsciously, you're not only asking them about each of your identities separately, right? When you're acting as all of your identities, since they are intersubjective, and you cannot control if and how other people read you, right? Again, I can't go out in the world as male without a race because my racial identity is this intersubjective thing, and people will still read, right, and interpret my racial identity as it is displayed, right? So, to think about it differently, we might ask, are some societal expectations regarding masculinity assigned to white men in the same way that they're assigned to black men, right? Are white men and black men depicted, for example, the same way in the media when it comes to depicting criminal behavior? Studies have shown time and time again that it's certainly not the case, right? Now, the reasonable answer to those questions is no, and indicates how our identities are intersectional. Your masculinity might be white, your lesbianism might be Chicana, your Asian identity might be feminine, right? This is intersectionality at work in how we see ourselves and how we act in the world, right? So, to bring it back to the political question, it's important for understanding how political and social power operates, a topic that we're going to explore at length a lot during the course of this class. So, let's say, for example, you wanted to support women's reproductive health by establishing a women's health center in each state in the country. You would likely place it in the largest city in each state where the population is the biggest. So, in Arizona, we'd put it in Phoenix. Now, let's also say there's a poor woman who lives in a rural part of the state, far away from Phoenix. We could ask, how will she afford to go to the city? Will she be able to afford a bus ticket if she has no car? Is there even a bus line? Can she afford to take the time off work when she has two jobs, right? Does she have children? And if so, if she's the caretaker, can she take this time away? By looking then at the category of women without recognizing how class and race interact with gender, we can overlook how oppression also operates in intersectional ways. In this example, in an effort to help all women, we might exacerbate class differences between women. In other words, maybe only certain women will be able to benefit from that help. Now, this is not to say that fighting social issues around a single identity is bad, right? We should definitely still establish women's health centers just like that. But we should also consider how other tactics are needed to address issues of social difference within a group as well. These differences, for example, between women. Historically, feminism in the West has been critiqued for failing to recognize the experiences of poor women and women of color in their politics and in their scholarship. Now, transnational feminism, which we'll talk about at the end of this course, is one of the major branches of thought producing that critique, and one that will guide a lot of our discussions in the third unit. Now, this brings us to the end of our lecture on identity, social construction, and intersectionality. I hope that you guys learned a lot from this lecture. I know we went pretty quickly, and I know I'm a fast talker, so please go back, rewind, take your time, pause, take notes, right, and go slowly through the presentation as you listen to the lecture. Thanks, and have a good one.